At first, it feels like a minor inconvenience. The lights flicker, appliances power down, and conversations pause mid-sentence as homes are swallowed by darkness. But when this happens not once or twice, but day after day, week after week, it stops being an inconvenience and becomes a signal. In South Africa, rolling blackouts, known locally as load shedding, have transformed everyday life into a constant negotiation with uncertainty. Elevators stall between floors, traffic lights fail at busy intersections, hospitals switch to emergency generators, hoping fuel supplies last through the night. What was once unthinkable in a modern industrialized economy has become routine. This is not the result of a single disaster or a temporary shortage. It is the visible symptom of a much deeper breakdown, one that stretches across energy, employment, infrastructure, governance, and public trust. South Africa was once considered the economic anchor of the African continent, a country with world-class engineers, deep financial markets, and institutions strong enough to manage a complex industrial economy. Today, that reputation feels increasingly detached from reality. The question many inside the country are asking quietly, and many outside are beginning to ask aloud, is deeply uncomfortable. Is South Africa still a functioning state, or is it sliding into something far more fragile? This is not a question about politics in the narrow sense. It is a question about whether a modern society can continue to operate when the systems that support daily life, electricity, jobs, safety, transport, and trust, are no longer reliable. South Africa offers a case study in how institutional erosion happens slowly, then all at once. It shows how advanced economies can weaken not through war or natural disaster, but through sustained mismanagement, corruption, and the quiet normalization of failure. The lights going out are not the beginning of the story. They are the moment when the story becomes impossible to ignore. For decades, Eskom was a point of national pride. It supplied some of the cheapest and most reliable electricity in the world, powering mines, factories, and cities across South Africa. Engineers from Eskom were consulted globally, and the utility ranked among the most efficient of its kind. The country's industrial economy was built on the assumption that electricity would always be available, always affordable, and always expanding alongside growth. That assumption no longer holds. Eskom today is a utility in a death spiral, burdened by aging infrastructure, crushing debt, and a legacy of corruption that has hollowed out its technical capacity. Load shedding is not a temporary response to peak demand. It is a permanent feature of the system, imposed because the grid can no longer meet even reduced levels of consumption. At the heart of the crisis is the failure to invest in generation capacity at the right time. As demand grew in the early 2000s, warnings from engineers were ignored. Political leadership delayed decisions, and when new power stations were finally approved, they became monuments to mismanagement. The Medupi and Kuzil coal plants, among the largest ever built, were meant to secure South Africa's energy future for generations. Instead, they arrived years late, billions over budget, and riddled with design flaws that still prevent them from operating at full capacity. These projects became pipelines for rent-seeking rather than engines of development. Contracts were inflated, coal supply agreements were manipulated, and maintenance budgets were stripped. In some cases, coal delivered to power stations was so poor in quality it actively damaged equipment. The result was predictable. Breakdowns increased, repairs took longer, and available capacity shrank year by year. As generation faltered, Eskom turned to emergency measures, most notably the large-scale use of diesel-powered turbines. These turbines were never designed to run continuously, and the fuel costs are enormous. Billions of dollars have been spent simply to keep the grid from collapsing entirely. That spending added to Eskom's debt, which now stands at levels so high the utility cannot service it without direct state support. This is where the crisis becomes systemic. Eskom's debt is ultimately sovereign debt. Every bailout weakens the national balance sheet and limits the government's ability to spend elsewhere. At the same time, electricity tariffs have risen sharply, pushing costs onto households and businesses already under strain. Higher prices drive lower consumption, which reduces Eskom's revenue, which in turn necessitates further tariff increases. This feedback loop is the classic utility death spiral, and South Africa is deep inside it. Municipalities compound the problem. Many local governments owe Eskom billions in unpaid bills, often because they themselves are financially insolvent. Electricity revenue is frequently diverted to cover other expenses, leaving Eskom unpaid. Enforcement is politically fraught, as cutting power to entire towns can trigger unrest. The result is a culture of non-payment that undermines the entire system. Perhaps most alarming is the way crime has become embedded in the energy crisis. Cable theft, sabotage, and organized syndicates targeting infrastructure have turned power stations into fortified zones. The attempted poisoning of a senior Eskom executive was a chilling reminder that the stakes are not merely financial. Electricity has become a battleground, and the utility is fighting enemies both inside and outside its gates. For an industrial economy, unreliable power is not just inconvenient, it is fatal. Factories cannot plan production, investors cannot model risk, and small businesses cannot absorb the cost of downtime. Eskom's collapse does not merely reflect South Africa's broader problems, it actively accelerates them. If electricity is the backbone of a modern economy, employment is its circulatory system. In South Africa, that system is failing at an alarming rate. Official unemployment hovers at levels that would be considered a crisis in any developed country, but the expanded definition, which includes those who have given up looking for work, reveals a far grimmer reality. For millions, especially the young, formal employment is not delayed, it is absent. Youth unemployment in South Africa ranks among the highest in the world. This is not a cyclical downturn or a temporary mismatch of skills. It is a structural failure that has persisted for years. A generation is coming of age with no realistic pathway into stable work, no prospect of advancement, and little faith that the system will ever include them. The social consequences are profound. Work is not only a source of income, it is a source of identity, stability, and social cohesion. When large segments of the population are excluded from the labour market, frustration hardens into resentment. Communities become brittle. Small shocks, such as food price increases or service failures, can trigger explosive responses, as seen during the widespread unrest of July 2021. The state has attempted to cushion the blow through an extensive system of social grants. These transfers prevent immediate humanitarian disaster and are morally difficult to withdraw. But they do not solve the underlying problem. A shrinking tax base cannot indefinitely support a growing population dependent on public assistance. This imbalance places immense pressure on public finances and deepens intergenerational tension. The informal economy absorbs some of the excess labour, but it has limits. Street trading, casual work, and gig-style employment provide survival income, not long-term security. Without growth in productive sectors, manufacturing, mining, logistics, energy, there is no engine capable of generating jobs at the scale required. For us and UK audiences, this dynamic should feel uncomfortably familiar. It echoes the hollowing out of industrial regions, the rise of precarious work, and the political volatility that follows economic exclusion. South Africa represents an extreme version of a problem advanced economies are also grappling with: what happens when growth no longer translates into broad-based opportunity. Unemployment on this scale is not merely an economic statistic. It is a destabilizing force that erodes trust in institutions, fuels crime, and makes radical alternatives more appealing. Combined with failing infrastructure and weak governance, it becomes a ticking time bomb. To understand how South Africa arrived at this point, it is not enough to point to incompetence or bad luck. The country experienced something far more corrosive: the deliberate capture of the state by private interests. This was not corruption at the margins. It was the systematic redirection of public institutions to serve a narrow network of political and business elites. At the center of this story is the relationship between senior political figures and a family of businessmen who gained extraordinary influence over state-owned enterprises, cabinet appointments, and procurement decisions. Through this access, they were able to extract billions from public companies, weakening institutions that were already under strain. State capture hollowed out Eskom, Transnet, and other critical entities. Qualified professionals were sidelined or pushed out, replaced by loyalists whose primary role was to facilitate extraction rather than ensure performance. Procurement processes became vehicles for looting, with inflated contracts and kickbacks draining resources from maintenance and investment. The damage was not limited to finances. Institutional memory was destroyed. Skilled engineers, auditors, and managers left, taking decades of experience with them. Systems that rely on continuity and expertise cannot recover quickly from such losses. Even after political leadership changed, the capacity to govern effectively did not simply return. Public inquiries exposed the scale of the looting in extraordinary detail. Testimony revealed how decisions were made, how warnings were ignored, and how accountability was systematically avoided. Yet for many citizens, the aftermath has been deeply disappointing. Prosecutions have been slow and in some cases non-existent. The perception that powerful figures face no consequences has further eroded trust in the rule of law. For international observers, this raises a critical point. Institutions are only as strong as their ability to enforce norms. Once enforcement collapses, recovery becomes exponentially harder. Investors factor political risk into every decision. Citizens withdraw emotionally from a system they believe is rigged. Cynicism replaces civic engagement. State capture explains why South Africa's crises are so intertwined. Energy failure, logistics breakdowns, and fiscal stress are not separate problems. They are symptoms of a system that was repurposed for extraction rather than development. Undoing that damage requires more than policy adjustments. It requires rebuilding institutions from the inside out, a process measured in decades, not election cycles. One of the most unsettling features of South Africa's decline is how openly criminal power has begun to replace state authority in parts of the economy. Nowhere is this more visible than in the construction sector, where organized groups routinely extort developers, halt projects, and enforce protection. Fees with violence. These groups are often referred to locally as construction mafias, but the term understates the seriousness of the problem. What is unfolding is the erosion of the state's monopoly on force in economic life. Major infrastructure projects, including housing developments, shopping centers, and even public works, are frequently disrupted by armed groups demanding a share of contracts or cash payments. When developers refuse, sites are shut down through intimidation, vandalism, or shootings. In many cases, police response is slow or non-existent, and prosecutions are rare. The message to investors is unmistakable: the rule of law is conditional. This phenomenon did not emerge in a vacuum. Chronic unemployment, weak policing, and political patronage networks created an environment where criminal groups could position themselves as alternative power brokers. In some areas, they operate with the tacit approval of local officials who benefit financially or fear retaliation. The line between criminality and politics becomes increasingly blurred. The economic impact is severe. Projects are delayed or abandoned, costs rise sharply due to security and extortion payments, and foreign investors quietly exit. Infrastructure that the country desperately needs, housing, transport links, energy facilities, fails to materialize. Over time, this feeds back into unemployment, service delivery failures, and social frustration, reinforcing the conditions that allowed the problem to grow in the first place. For audiences in developed economies, this may sound distant, but the underlying lesson is familiar. When institutions fail to enforce contracts and protect property, informal power structures fill the vacuum. Once normalized, reversing that process becomes extraordinarily difficult. Businesses adapt by avoiding risk, citizens adapt by lowering expectations, and the economy shrinks around defensive behavior. The construction mafias are not just criminals exploiting opportunity, they are symptoms of a state losing its capacity to guarantee basic order. That loss carries consequences far beyond any single sector. If electricity is the backbone of the economy, logistics is its nervous system. In South Africa, that system is increasingly dysfunctional. Ports are congested, rail networks are unreliable, and freight, that once moved efficiently across the country, now sits idle for days or weeks. For an export-driven economy dependent on mining, agriculture, and manufacturing, this breakdown is devastating. State-owned logistics companies were once among the most capable institutions in the country. Today, they are plagued by equipment shortages, theft, mismanagement, and skills erosion. Rail lines are stripped for scrap metal faster than they can be repaired. Locomotives stand idle for lack of spare parts. Ports operate well below global efficiency standards, forcing exporters to reroute shipments or miss delivery windows entirely. The consequences ripple toward. Mining firms reduce output because they cannot get product to port. Farmers lose crops waiting for refrigerated containers that never arrive. Manufacturers struggle to source inputs and deliver finished goods. Each failure compounds the next, turning logistics into a binding constraint on growth. Private companies attempt to adapt by shifting freight to road transport. But this creates new problems. Roads deteriorate under heavy loads, accidents increase, and fuel costs rise. What should be an integrated national system becomes an expensive patchwork of workarounds. Smaller firms, unable to absorb these costs, simply disappear. For global investors, logistics failure is a red flag. It signals not just inefficiency but institutional decay. Supply chains depend on predictability. When transport becomes unreliable, long-term planning becomes impossible. Capital flows elsewhere. This is not a uniquely South African story. Advanced economies have seen glimpses of similar fragility during supply chain disruptions. South Africa shows what happens when those disruptions become permanent rather than exceptional. An economy that cannot move goods efficiently cannot compete, no matter how rich its natural resources. As systems weaken, those with options begin to leave. In South Africa, capital flight is not dramatic or sudden. It is quiet, methodical, and persistent. Professionals emigrate, companies offshore profits, families move savings abroad. Each decision makes sense in isolation. Together they hollow out the economy. Highly skilled workers are among the first to go. Engineers, doctors, accountants, and entrepreneurs respond rationally to deteriorating services, safety concerns, and declining opportunities. Their departure reduces the tax base and weakens institutional capacity further. The cycle is self-reinforcing. Domestic firms increasingly structure themselves to minimize exposure. Headquarters shift abroad. New investment is directed to other jurisdictions. Even companies that remain operational locally hedge their risk by keeping capital mobile. The result is an economy that functions, but no longer commits. Foreign direct investment follows the same logic. Investors are not necessarily hostile to risk, but they demand compensation for it. When risk becomes unquantifiable, driven by power outages, logistics failures, crime, and policy uncertainty, capital chooses safer destinations. For the state, this creates a fiscal dilemma. Fewer taxpayers must support more dependents. Infrastructure deteriorates faster. Public services weaken. Attempts to increase taxation accelerate the exit, deepening the problem. This pattern is visible in many countries under strain. What makes South Africa notable is the speed with which confidence has eroded relative to its institutional starting point. This was not a marginal economy. It was a regional anchor. Its decline demonstrates how quickly capital can reassess assumptions when trust is broken. Perhaps the most dangerous phase of systemic decline is not collapse, but normalization. In South Africa, power cuts are scheduled into daily life. Delayed trains are expected. Crime is managed rather than eliminated. Citizens adapt, innovate, and endure. On the surface, society appears resilient. Underneath, standards quietly fall. Normalization dulls urgency. When failure becomes routine, outrage fades. Political accountability weakens. Incremental deterioration replaces dramatic crisis, making it harder to mobilize collective action. People stop asking when systems will be fixed and start asking how to live around them. This adaptive behavior is understandable. Households buy generators, businesses install solar panels, communities hire private security. Each solution reduces dependence on the state. Each also fragments society further, separating those who can afford resilience from those who cannot. For external observers, this creates a misleading picture. The country does not look like a failed state. Markets operate, institutions exist, elections are held, but functionality is uneven and declining. The gap between formal structures and lived reality widens. The long-term risk is entrenchment. Once parallel systems replace public ones, rebuilding becomes politically and economically harder. Citizens who no longer rely on the state resist paying for its recovery. Those who remain dependent feel abandoned. Social cohesion erodes. South Africa's story is not finished. Decline is not destiny. But the warning is clear. Systemic failure rarely arrives as a single event. It arrives as a series of compromises, adaptations, and lowered expectations. By the time collapse is undeniable, reversing course is far more difficult than anyone expects. It is tempting to view South Africa's trajectory as a localized failure, the product of unique political mistakes, historical baggage, or governance problems that do not apply elsewhere. That assumption is comforting, but it is also dangerous. What makes South Africa relevant is not that it failed, but how it failed. The pattern is one that appears repeatedly across history and increasingly across modern economies. Institutional decay, occurring not through sudden collapse, but through gradual erosion under stress. The country did not wake up one day without electricity, functioning ports, or fiscal credibility. Each system weakened incrementally. Maintenance was deferred. Skilled professionals left. Corruption became normalized. Political incentives shifted towards short-term survival rather than long-term capacity. By the time consequences became unavoidable, the systems were already too fragile to absorb shocks. Advanced economies are not immune to this process. They differ in scale, complexity, and resilience, but they share many of the same structural pressures. Aging infrastructure, rising public debt, political polarization, demographic strain, and declining institutional trust are not uniquely South African problems. They are global conditions. The difference lies in margin for error. Wealthier nations have more buffers, stronger currencies, deeper capital markets, and greater policy credibility allow them to postpone consequences longer. But postponement is not resolution. When stress accumulates across multiple systems at once, even robust economies face limits. South Africa offers a case study in what happens when those limits are reached. Not through panic or revolution, but through exhaustion. That is the warning embedded in this story. One of the most misunderstood aspects of economic and institutional risk is the belief that stability today implies safety tomorrow. Complex systems often appear stable right up until the moment they fail. In fact, prolonged stability can increase fragility by encouraging leverage, complacency, and dependency. South Africa's power grid functioned for decades with minimal disruption. That success bred underinvestment and deferred maintenance. When problems finally surfaced, they cascaded faster than expected because redundancy had been stripped away. The system had no slack left. Financial systems behave similarly. Extended periods of growth encourage debt accumulation. Asset prices rise. Risk appears manageable because nothing has gone wrong recently. Policymakers and investors extrapolate recent conditions indefinitely into the future. This is not irrational, it is human. But it is also how crises form. When stress finally exceeds capacity, failure does not arrive gently, it arrives through nonlinear reactions. Power outages escalate rapidly. Credit dries up suddenly. Confidence collapses faster than models predict. The absence of small failures allows large failures to dominate. This is why the warning signs matter more than headline growth numbers. Declining maintenance, rising delinquencies, skills shortages, institutional hollowing, and capital flight are not dramatic events. They are quiet signals that resilience is being consumed. South Africa demonstrates that the most dangerous phase is not collapse, but apparent normalcy during decay. No system fails in isolation from incentives. Political structures shape outcomes not through intention but through what they reward and punish. In South Africa, electoral incentives increasingly favored short-term appeasement over long-term capacity building. Infrastructure investment lacks immediate political payoff. Maintenance is invisible when done correctly. Corruption, by contrast, delivers immediate benefits to those within the system. This dynamic is not unique. Democracies everywhere struggle with long-term planning. Infrastructure projects outlast political terms. Fiscal discipline is unpopular. Structural reform creates concentrated pain and diffuse benefits. When institutions are strong, they counterbalance these tendencies. Independent civil services, credible regulators, and professional management constrain political interference. When those institutions weaken, Can incentives shift decisively toward extraction rather than stewardship? South Africa's experience illustrates how quickly this transition can occur once institutional credibility erodes. Skilled administrators leave, decision-making becomes politicized, performance metrics disappear, accountability fades. Eventually, the system stops optimizing for outcomes and begins optimizing for survival. At that point, reform becomes exponentially harder because the people empowered to enact it are also those most threatened by it. For external observers, this highlights an uncomfortable truth. Governance quality matters more than ideology. Systems fail not because of left or right policies, but because incentives reward behavior that undermines capacity. Economic decline is rarely just economic. It reshapes social relationships, expectations, and norms. In South Africa, the cumulative impact of failing services, insecurity, and inequality has eroded trust between citizens and the state, between communities, and even between individuals. When electricity is unreliable, businesses cannot plan. When policing is inconsistent, communities turn inward. When public services fail, private alternatives emerge, deepening inequality. Those who can afford resilience detach from those who cannot. This fragmentation weakens social cohesion. Shared expectations disappear. The idea of a common future erodes. People stop asking what can be built together and focus instead on personal survival strategy. Trust is one of the most underappreciated economic assets. It lowers transaction costs, enables cooperation, and supports long-term investment. Once lost, it is extraordinarily difficult to restore. South Africa's challenge is not simply rebuilding infrastructure, but rebuilding belief. Belief that institutions can function. Belief that effort will be rewarded. Belief that the future is worth investing in. Without that belief, even technically sound reforms struggle to gain traction. It is often assumed that decline and recovery are symmetrical processes. They are not. Decline can occur gradually, driven by neglect and misaligned incentives. Recovery requires deliberate coordination, trust, capital, and time. By the time systems fail visibly, recovery demands far more resources than maintenance ever would have. Skills must be rebuilt. Capital must be attracted back. Institutions must re-establish credibility. None of this happens quickly. South Africa faces this asymmetry now. Even with political will, the scale of repair required is immense. Power generation cannot be rebuilt overnight. Logistics networks take years to restore. Human capital lost to emigration is difficult to replace. This is not to say recovery is impossible. Countries have reversed decline before, but they did so under conditions of social consensus, disciplined leadership, and external support. Those conditions are not easily manufactured. The broader lesson is preventative. Decline is cheap. Recovery is expensive. Why does this matter beyond South Africa? Because the global economy is more interconnected than ever. Supply chains, financial flows, migration, and geopolitical stability are linked. When regional anchors weaken, ripple effects follow. South Africa's decline affects neighboring economies, commodity markets, investment flows, and political stability across southern Africa. Similar processes in larger economies would have far-reaching global consequences. The world is entering an era where multiple systems are under stress simultaneously. Energy transitions, demographic shifts, climate pressures, and debt accumulation are testing institutional capacity everywhere. The margin for error is shrinking. At an individual level, preparation means understanding risk, diversifying exposure, maintaining flexibility, and avoiding over-reliance on any single system's continued perfection. History does not repeat mechanically, but it does rhyme. Systems that ignore warning signs eventually pay the price. Systems that respond early preserve options. South Africa's story is still unfolding. Its outcome is not predetermined, but its trajectory offers lessons that extend far beyond its borders. The most unsettling aspect of systemic decline is that it feels survivable until it isn't. People adapt. Markets adjust. Life goes on. That is precisely why early warnings are dismissed. South Africa did not collapse. It frayed, and fraying is harder to see, harder to measure, and easier to ignore. The question for other societies is not whether they will face stress. They will.